Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Mormon Stories podcast. I am your host, as always, John DeLynn. I am super excited for today's interview. It is October 19th, 2017, and we are coming to you recorded from someone's gracious home in Murray, Utah. And we have a crowd of people here gathered to enjoy a special interview with, I would say, one of the most controversial figures in Mormonism of the past 2 decades. His name is Mike Norton, and I first learned about Mike back in 2004, 2005, when Mike, along with his friend whose code name was Hiram, started a podcast called The Church Is Not True. And that was a podcast that I listened to before I started Mormon Stories podcast, and that was part of an inspiration for me to start Mormon Stories podcast from a lot of different perspectives. And so, but it didn't take me long after listening to that podcast, The Church Is Not True, to learn about Mike. Mike had a history from even before that podcast. As far as I know, Mike was the first, if not one of the first people to record the LDS Church's temple ceremonies and put them on the internet. He also created a website, as far as I know, called josephlied.com, and would sort of stand outside, as I remember, temples like the Manti Temple and hold up the sign and advertise that website to people who are coming in and out of the temple. Now, I may get some of these facts wrong, but this is my memory of Mike. Since then, Mike has done other things. After they ended their podcast, Mike kind of disappeared for a while as far as I was paying attention, but then he resurfaced doing something super controversial, which was to assume someone else's identity as an active Mormon, become fully active in the church as a resigned Mormon, okay, under the name of this other person who lent his identity to Mike. And then Mike got active in the church, got a calling, and received a temple recommend under a fake identity, and then re-entered the temple to record the new temple ceremonies to sort of capture all the changes. And that's about as hardcore gangster of an approach to dealing with the LDS Church as I've ever heard. So we'll be talking about that. And then most recently, it was Mike Norton who was the first to, as I understand it, released the video of Savannah that ended up going viral and global. And as Mike's told me, I think tens of millions of people across the world have now watched that video of Savannah, which is the young 12, 13-year-old girl who came out as lesbian during her testimony in her Mormon ward, and a member of her bishopric asked her to turn off the microphone, or turned off the microphone, asked her to sit down before she was able to finish her interview. So Mike has been involved in a lot of stuff. And I've known about Mike for a long, long time. And for a long, long time, I didn't want to interview Mike. And we could talk about that, but I'll just explain why I've chosen to interview Mike. So I didn't interview Mike for a long time because I didn't really have a sense for who he was or his motivations. And frankly, especially while I was active in the church and extra sensitive to being excommunicated, I didn't want to do anything that could jeopardize my membership. Since then, I still will be candid. I've been really torn about Mike's tactics. I don't want this interview at all to be construed as an endorsement of Mike's tactics necessarily, because these are things that I personally wouldn't do, many of the things he's done. And there are things that I wouldn't encourage other people to do, especially when it comes to breaking the law, if there have been instances where he's broken the law, and we'll talk about that. But I also believe that, there are issues and controversies around, how sacred the Mormon temple ceremony is to people, violation of the church's property, and just, what does Mike's actions do to the reputation of people who leave the church? Does the sorts of actions that Mike does give post-Mormons and ex-Mormons a bad name, in the sense of making, sort of fulfilling the stereotypes that post-Mormons are angry and bitter and and broken and sad and willing to do anything to harm the church. And I'm not saying anything bad about Mike. I'm just saying those have been the types of things that have given me pause about interviewing Mike. I'd say one sort of thing flipped me, maybe a couple things flipped me recently to make me open to interviewing Mike. The first was a private conversation I had with Mike over the phone where he started talking to me about his motivations. And if I can be totally honest, he actually started crying during that phone conversation about how what his motives were and how important this work was to him. And he showed this real emotionally vulnerable side that showed to me sort of the heart behind what he does. So that sort of made me say, wow, Mike's a little more nuanced or a little more sophisticated or complex than probably his public image. And so that made me want to say, hey, that's something worth showing. And so just like with that Sean McCraney interview I did many, many years ago where so many people saw him as this evil anti-Mormon, he showed a personal side that was actually quite revealing and interesting to my listeners. I am engaging and approaching this interview with sort of the same intent. So I've talked to Mike and I've requested of him before this interview that we not, say explicit things about the temple that would be offensive to our believing listeners, that we do our best not to use this opportunity to trash the Mormon church or be disrespectful to it. The spirit and the heart behind my intention of this interview is to show Mike's story and to show kind of what makes him tick and what motivates him, and to try and probe a little bit more to understand why he uses the tactics he does. So hopefully that's where this interview, the spirit of this interview, comes from. I'll just also say something that may be viewed as a little bit controversial. I see, I've been willing to interview Mormon apologists on Mormon Stories because we try and do a balance. And I see Mormon apologists as no more ethical than in the outcome of what they do than the work that Mike does. So I'm not saying their tactics are comparable, but in terms of the ethics of the outcome of the work of Mormon apologetics versus the ethics of the outcome of Mike's work, I don't see apologists as having any more of an upper hand in terms of morals or ethics than Mike. And so if I'm willing to interview, and I'm eager to interview Mormon apologists, then I feel like it's fair to interview Mike, because I feel like the impact of his work is as legitimate as the impact of the work of Mormon apologists. So we could talk about that more in future episodes. So that's my long disclaimer. Before we totally jump in, I just want to thank everyone who supports Mormon Stories podcast. Your donations make this possible. So if you appreciate this work, if you benefit from it, just know that all this is possible because of the donations of those who contribute to the Open Stories Foundation and the Mormon Stories. We're going to be doing more events like this in the coming months and years, where in the Salt Lake area and maybe other areas, we invite people to attend these events, not only so they can get a personal sense of these interviews, but so that they can ask questions and meet some of the people involved. So what we're doing to sort of thank those who donate to us is that we make sure, even though these events are free to attend, we offer Mormon Stories and Open Stories Foundation donors first opportunities to join these events. So if you want to be a part of these sorts of events, one incentive is to become a monthly subscriber at 10 or 15 or 25 or $100 a month, whatever you can afford. And one of the benefits you'll get is you'll be put on an email list and given early invite. So for those of you who are here who are donors, I just want to thank you for your support, because you make all this possible. So thank you. We are looking at setting up a Patreon website that we can use to help incentivize other people to donate to Mormon Stories. So be looking for a Patreon website called Mormon Stories in the coming weeks. We'll tell you more about that as we solidify those plans. And then finally, we have various workshops and retreats coming up to support transitioning and post-Mormons please go to mormonstories.org/events. There are events in October and November of 2017 in the Salt Lake area and in San Francisco area. So we'd love to have you attend if you can. So those are all the business items. Mike Norton, after over a decade of being aware of your work, welcome to Mormon Stories Podcast.
Thank you. Thank you. In fact, your third episode was Hiram, my podcast partner back in 2005.
That's right. In fact, I did that interview before I interviewed Greg Prince.
Yeah. In fact, you talked with Hiram and specifically talked about the plan to interview him and me separately, he and I separately, and so people that are shocked that you would interview me, I just tell them we've been talking about doing this for well over 10 years.
Yeah, so check out episode 3 of Mormon Stories with Hiram, which was Noah's compadre in that early podcast. All right, so Noah, Mike Norton. I don't know where Noah came from.
That's my new name, please.
That's right, NewNameNoah. That's right, NewNameNoah. I should mention that. That's the handle you go by.
NewNameNoah.
So, Mike, let's begin by just talking about your early Mormon story. Talk about if you want to talk briefly about your ancestry. Do you have Mormon ancestry? Were you a convert to the church? Were you born in the covenant?
Yeah. On my father's side, my father was a 4th generation Mormon, so I guess it'd be 5th. And my children were 6th generation Mormons. My mother was a convert to the church, joined in her early 20s because she was dating my father and he was LDS, and she had a reason to join. So I was born and raised in the church.
Where?
Primarily Colorado and Southern California, up near Bakersfield in the San Joaquin Valley. Had a happy, healthy upbringing and childhood. I was the youngest of 7 kids, 6 boys and 1 girl. And I actually got baptized just a few days after my 8th birthday, which I thought was kind of cool, the date. I was baptized on the 4th of July, 1976. So it was the bicentennial. I remember my dad telling me the reason for all these fireworks is because you joined the church. And even back then, I was smart enough to know that wasn't entirely accurate. But truth be told, I loved the church growing up, with the exception of a very, very brief period, maybe I'd say maybe 9 months to a year. When I was about 15, 16 years old, I guess 16, I went inactive for a period of time. Typical teenage kid. I just wasn't interested in going to church for 3 hours a day. 3 hours every Sunday. So I went inactive for a short period of time. I worked with a bunch of friends that all smoked, and it got to the point where I actually started smoking cigarettes a little bit, and that was my brief fling with inactivity and what have you. But
did your family, was it a traditional Mormon family? Did you have family home evenings, scripture study?
Traditional Mormon family in that we would, about once every 2 or 3 years, we would vow we're going to have family home evening every week. I don't know. I don't know. A lot of people actually have family home evening every single Monday. Most people, it seems like it goes in spurts where they vow they're going to, they do it for a few weeks, maybe even a few months, and they just kind of peters off and they stop doing it. Our family was no different. I grew up in the church when we would go to church literally 3 times a week. It'd be twice on Sunday. You go for sacrament, and then you go home, and you come back for Sunday school. And then the kids, of course, would come in, what was it, Tuesday night, I think, for primary. And that was primarily in Southern California. So the nearest church house was, I don't know, probably 15 miles from our house or so. And I went to seminary actually in Colorado. I lived in Colorado when I was a little kid, then California. Parents got divorced, moved back to Colorado. Went to seminary, and in the early 80s, back when seminary consisted of getting up at 5:30 in the morning and going to the local church house where half the kids would be wearing pajamas practically. You pull up 2 chairs, one for you, one for your feet. The teacher would bring donuts every Friday, and I thoroughly enjoyed it.
Did you do 4 years of seminary?
I did not. I did 3 years of seminary. The reason I didn't do 4 is because I moved to Utah essentially my senior year, right before my senior year, and I attended seminary for about 2 weeks and hated it from day one. It was nothing like seminary in Colorado. There were no donuts. There were textbooks, which I kind of blew my mind. I'm like, wait, we have textbooks for this? I thought the scriptures were our textbooks. We had homework. They suck the fun out of it. We didn't have scripture chases where we get together with other seminary classes and stuff. So I lost interest in it very quickly. And unlike a majority of the kids in the class, it seemed, I wasn't forced to go to seminary. It was voluntary, and I made it very clear within a couple of weeks, not interested. I don't like it, and I'm not going to do it. And I got no pushback from that.
When you were a teenager, did you have a testimony? Did you want a testimony? Did you try and obtain a testimony? What was your spiritual life like as a teenager, if you had one?
Yeah, I mean, I had various callings as a kid. Maybe the teachers' quorum president, and I give the 2.5-minute talks occasionally. I believed as much as any kid. I mostly believed because I was born and raised in it. I literally knew no different. Do you remember trying to pray Moroni's promise, trying to find out if it was really true? I do. I'll admit, in my opinion again, like most Mormon youth, I did not actually read the entire Book of Mormon as a kid. In fact, the first time I read the entire Book of Mormon was on my mission. And people who are being completely honest, I think you'd find that's very common. Very common for people to read the Book of Mormon for the first time while they're actually on a mission. I'm just noticing something. You keep trying, as you portray different elements of your story, it seems important to you to sort of communicate what other people's experiences are relative to yours. I'm curious what makes you feel like you need to do that. Because I think that I think I was an average Mormon. When I got on my mission, I like to think that I stepped up my game a little bit. Do you feel embarrassed that your family didn't have family meeting every week, or that you didn't have a testimony or didn't read the Book of Mormon before? Do you feel like you have to justify that? Or? No, not at all. I mean, I really think we were average. Okay, that's fine. I think if you took 100 random Mormons off the street and asked, honestly, how many of you actually have family home evening every Monday, I would be shocked if the number was more than like 20. So what made you decide to go on a mission? When you wavered in commitment? I almost didn't, actually. I was hanging out with the wrong crowd when I was 16. Smoked a few cigarettes. I drank alcohol one time when I was 17. But for the most part, I mean, I was a good Mormon kid. I was afraid to go on a mission because of 2 reasons. Number one, I had a girlfriend. I was pretty sure that if I went on a mission, same would happen to me as happened 10,000 times before, and she'd Dear John me and go off with somebody else, and she'd be married by the time I got home. And also, frankly, I'm embarrassed by it now. I lacked at the time confidence in myself and my ability to learn a foreign language. And I was absolutely terrified that I would get sent to like China or Russia or even Mexico. I didn't speak any English. I didn't take any language classes in school. And my personal confidence in my abilities were I thought for sure I'm going to get a foreign speaking mission, and I was terrified.
You're scared about that.
The irony is, when I went on my mission and was in the MTC, within 24 hours, I'm seeing these these potato farming kids from Idaho, and they're learning Spanish and French and all that, and I instantly realized, okay, if that kid can do it, I could totally have done this. So now, in hindsight, I actually wish I had gone on a foreign speaking mission, especially Spanish.
What high school in Utah did you graduate from?
I did my senior year at Logan High, class of 86.
In Cache Valley?
Yeah.
So you were born in 68?
I was born in 68,
Okay.
and yeah, moved around a little bit because my father's work, but...
Did you do any college before your mission?
No, I never done any college.
Okay. So you go on your mission to where?
California Ventura Mission.
Okay. So you go back to California?
Yeah, in fact, it's funny. My first area was Bakersfield, which was less than an hour's drive away from the town that I grew up in. I call home, and that was Visalia, California. So my very first area was, although my hometown wasn't in our mission, it was very, very close to our mission, and I actually ran into several people that knew me and knew my family, and were shocked that I was back in California on a mission.
So what, again, I may have missed this, what led you to decide to do the mission, given all your insecurities?
I prayed. I knew how much pressure there was to go on a mission. Surprisingly for me, there wasn't that much pressure. Like I said, there's 6 boys in my family. Of the 6 of us, 4 went on a mission. I didn't feel an overwhelming amount of pressure from my family. I just kind of felt pressure in general, and then one day the bishop, and I was actually, when I moved to Utah, I was living with a brother of mine that was just a few years older, and he was essentially my legal guardian. I was 16 and he was 23. So there wasn't pressure from him or anybody else, but the bishop just called me in his office one day and told me, the Lord has called you on a mission, and would you be willing to accept the calling? And I told him I would have to pray about it. Honestly, my gut instinct would have been to say no. If he said, "Give me an answer right now, yes or no," I would have said no.
So what happened when you prayed about it?
I drove to the parking lot of the Logan Temple. Late at night, the gate was open, there was nobody there, and I prayed fervently, seeking guidance regarding whether I should go on a mission or not. And frankly, I described it then, and I would describe it now the same way. I got an answer to my prayer that I thought was unquestionable. It was almost as if I could hear a voice, an actual audible voice. The answer was so strong, and the answer I got was, "You know what the right decision is, make it." And I honestly, I sat there and cried, because my attitude was, well, there goes my girlfriend, but I've got to do the right thing, and I felt like the right thing to do was to go on a mission. So I did.
What type of missionary were you?
I was me. I was passionate. I was imperfect. Got in trouble one time because I kissed a girl in a ward that I was in. Diana Darling. She slipped me a note one time when I went to her house. My companion, I went to her parents' house for dinner, and slipped me a note underneath the table, and made it very clear what her intentions were. And she wanted to meet me privately away from my companion, and we made arrangements to meet outside of the house where my companion and I were living, and made out with Diana Darling. And she told her best friend, who told her boyfriend, who was a former missionary from our mission, who told our mission president, and I was demoted from district leader. This is well past the halfway point of my mission. Demoted from district leader to junior companion. But when I say I was a passionate missionary, I was just as aggressive and passionate of a missionary as I am an ex-Mormon missionary now. For example, the very first area of my mission, Bakersfield, I said to my training companion, why don't we go to this Baptist church down the street and let's ask the minister if we can teach his congregation about what we believe. And he thought I was crazy, and I said, I'll do the talking. And he said, all right. So we did, and I made it a habit of every single area of my mission. We would go typically just to the Baptist churches, occasionally a non-denominational church. And my spiel was essentially, I would say to the minister, a lot of churches like to teach their congregation about what Mormons believe, and sometimes they get the facts a little wrong. And so we thought perhaps if you ever have any intention of teaching your congregation, why not let them get it straight from the horse's mouth? Why not let us come in and teach your congregation about what Mormons believe? And the very first one, the minister's name was Garth Black, and he kind of patted me on the shoulder and said, well, thank you. I appreciate that offer, and I'll keep that in mind. And of course, the answer was no. And I did that in every area of my mission. And my last area was Thousand Oaks, California. My second to last companion, Jeff Adams, and I went to the First Christian Church of Thousand Oaks. We sat through their services. At the end of the services, I went up to the minister and gave him the same spiel. We'd like to teach your congregation sometime. And he said, well, I think that would be a lovely idea. And I just looked at my companion. He looked at me, and I said, we have a lot to say. We might actually need 2 Sundays. If maybe we could take 2 Sundays, that would be fantastic. And he said, I think that could be arranged. Let's do that. And it wasn't the next week, but the week after that and the week after that, we taught essentially the equivalent of the gospel doctrine class. We taught all of the adults in the First Christian Church of Thousand Oaks what the Mormons believe. And so we kind of compiled six missionary discussions down into 2. We brought the sister missionaries in. Of course, we sang a song to bring in the spirit, and gave them all a copy of the Book of Mormon. And that was actually my last area of my mission. I went home a month and a half after that, but it was a highlight of my mission. I mean, not a lot of people can say they literally taught a congregation on their mission.
Did you have baptisms on your mission?
Yeah. I think just about everybody that goes on a mission, if they're honest, they'll say not only did they have baptisms in most cases, they know how many they had. And I was no different. In fact, at the end of the mission, our president would actually tell us, well, let's see, Elder, it looks like you had, X amount of, I had 12 baptisms on my mission.
Were any of those really special conversion experiences for you? Or
oh, yeah.
Were the families meant a lot to you?
I can think of the names still. David Nickel, Joyce Bryan, her daughter Brooke Hubbard, James Rothfeld. Some of them, you know how it is when you're a missionary, you get transferred to a new area, and there's a baptism that week. As far as the mission president is concerned, that's your credit. You could be teaching somebody for 6 months, move, but a new companion comes in, and they get the credit for the baptism. So I didn't really care about the credit, but yeah, it happened where I'd have some baptisms that meant the world to me, and taught them from day one. And there were some baptisms that I met them a week and a half before the baptism.
But you definitely had some conversions where you felt very connected to the people.
Oh yeah,
and it meant a lot to you to be a part of those conversions.
Yeah.
Overall, did you serve a successful and worthy, complete mission?
With the exception of Diana.
Okay.
In fact, I extended my mission twice, actually. I had the opportunity to go home, I think it was September 16th of 89, and I was bothered by that because I went into the MTC on September 23rd of 87, and I didn't feel fulfilled. serving less than 2 full years. So I asked, can I go on the next transfer? And the next transfer was like October 7th. And that came, and right before that came, I asked the mission president, could I maybe go to the next transfer? So I wound up being released on Halloween of 1989, and I loved it. I didn't obey all the rules. There was a time my companion and I got in our car and we drove to the Hollywood sign and literally danced on top of the Hollywood sign, and I've got pictures to prove it. The Hollywood sign was not in my mission boundaries, so we bent a rule here and there, like a lot of missionaries. We would occasionally unhook the odometer on our car. Never buy a used car from the LDS church, because the missionaries had it. Odds are they've unhooked that odometer, because you're limited on miles. You only have so many miles every single month, and when you run out of miles, you just stop driving the car. So we learned very quickly how to unhook the odometer on a 1987 Ford Taurus.
How do you unhook the odometer of a car?
It's very simple, surprisingly. Yeah.
So some are going to say, oh, well, see, Mike Norton had a very early penchant at breaking rules. Well,
my penchant for breaking rules goes back to my
right.
early childhood.
That's what I said.
Oh, yeah.
Early. So if someone were to say, oh, well, you weren't really ever converted, you weren't ever really committed to the church, you were a troublemaker from the start, it sounds like what you want to say is these are just normal things that average Mormons do.
I would challenge you to find more than a tiny handful of missionaries that did not at some time or another break the rules on their mission. I was a 19-year-old kid. You're going to do things you shouldn't do. You can call them sins. You can call them whatever you want. I would occasionally break the rules. And I don't think that made me unique or different.
Right. For sure.
I was average.
In my mission, APs and zone leaders broke major rules.
Yeah.
So
and I actually lived with some zone leaders for a period of time. Yeah. One of them wound up marrying our mission president's oldest daughter. I saw them break the rules all the time.
Right.
It was nothing unusual to break the rules occasionally.
Before we jump into sort of your path post-mission to leaving the church, if you reflect on your time up to the end of your mission in the church, especially in your adolescent years, did you have any just marvelously positive spiritual experiences, including your mission and your adolescence? And did you have any damaging or harmful experiences through your adolescence and up into your mission? In other words, before we talk about your path leaving, talk about the extent to which you loved and were grateful for your participation in the church, and to what extent you experienced things that might have been damaging and harmful to you.
In hindsight, if I had damaging or harmful experiences in the church, I have blocked them out of my memory.
So no deep shame from like masturbation or sins you committed, or ecclesiastical abuse or any of that stuff.
I do remember though. I tend to be. I can be very sarcastic, which does not translate well into the written form sometimes. I think a lot of times I'll see comments online that say, that Mike Norton, he's an asshole. And it's like, oh, you just don't get me. I like to say that I have as they say back east, a wicked awesome sense of humor. And I'm very sarcastic and
But about your experiences.
I loved the church growing up. I truly loved it. In fact, I actually was kind of the unofficial mission apologist in my mission. At the very beginning of my mission, I decided we need to learn what the enemy is saying. And the enemy were the anti-Mormons, because the people were going to encounter this. And I had 2 years ahead of me, and I knew I need to have the answers to these questions, so when I am encountered with it, I can give a solid answer, because I know there's answers because I knew the church was true. And so right off the bat, at the very beginning of my mission, I developed a plan to get my hands on as much anti-Mormon literature as possible, but I didn't want to pay for it. So this is before the internet. I called a number in Salt Lake, Utah Lighthouse Ministry, and talked to a lovely woman named Sandra Tanner. And I gave her some spiel where I told her I was investigating the church. I told her my real name. My name is Mike Norton. I'm investigating the church. I'm thinking about joining the LDS church. Somebody's told me that you might be able to help me out and share some information with me. And there's others like you. I've heard names tossed out, Walter Martin and Ed Decker and of course yourself and Gerald. Can you help me? Not only did Sandra send me books for free, but she also gave me the home phone numbers of literally every big name anti-Mormon you could think of, from Walter Martin, the Bible Answer Man, to Ed Decker and Dick Bear, Chuck and Dolly Sackett. I had all their home phone numbers, and so I would call them all and just pretend to be an investigator and ask if they could, help me out and steer me in the right direction. If they have any material, I'd be happy to read it. And I started getting all this anti-Mormon stuff in the mail, and one of the first ones I read was The God Makers. And The God Makers solidified my belief that the church is true because, and I've talked with Ed Decker about this before. Ed Decker is the author of The God Makers, or one of the co-authors. He made a well-known movie, The God Makers. But, and I've told him this before, and I'll say it again, it is complete trash. It paints Mormons out to be literally Satan worshipers, and it's just one of the most poorly written pieces of crap I have ever read. And as a Mormon, I thought that way, and I feel that way now as an ex-Mormon. I have told Ed Decker to his face, frankly, if it wasn't for you and your piece of crap book, I might have left the church when I was 19 or 20 years old.
How did his work make you think the church was true?
It didn't. It just strengthened my testimony that the anti-Mormons have to lie and just make stuff up because my brain rationalized it as, well, if they're lying like this, it's because the church is true. I mean, why not just tell the truth? You don't tell the truth because the truth is damaging to you, and I was absolutely convinced the church is true, and this just proves it because the anti-Mormons are just saying crap. And Walter Martin, the Bible Answer Man, who I believe is dead now, he had a book like A Maze of Mormonism or something, but he also had this whole slant of Mormons don't believe in the right Jesus, and so they're all going to hell, and I just thought, well, what a load of crap. But I got into Sandra Tanner's book, Gerald and Sandra Tanner's book, one of them. I think she sent me a couple of them. And
Mormonism, Shadow, and Reality.
Mormonism, Shadow, and Reality, or Reality. That scared the hell out of me, honestly. I got halfway through the first dozen pages and stopped reading it. That was the one book that was seriously frightening me and making me...
Why was it frightening?
Because it was just so matter of fact. It was so black and white. I mean, she has photocopies of pages from, the Journal of Discourses, and there's things in there, and I'm reading it, and I checked out a couple of her sources just to verify that these sources were accurate and true, and it bothered me. Some of the things that the early church leaders would say. Brigham Young said some horrific things.
And that was disturbing to have primary sources.
Oh, yeah.
Be disturbing. Okay, I'm going to pause for a second because what I asked you was, reflecting on your early years in the church, did you have positive experiences overall and or negative experiences? And I do want to talk about your perspective on the Tanners and Ed Decker and all that, but I don't want to lose the question. So just, if you can, what I heard you say was your memory of your time in the church was overall very positive up through the end of your mission.
One of my earliest memories of the church was actually in the early 1970s sometime. The church came out with a big thing pushing food storage and all that. And I remember going to the supermarket with my father and a couple of my brothers, and we got 4 or 5 shopping carts full of food that we stocked our pantry with. And I remember distinctly thinking that this is in preparation for something big. I mean, the prophet has spoken. The prophet has made it clear, get your food storage, because, you know, these are the latter days. But I still look back at that as a fond memory. I mean, it was late at night. I think it was midnight or something, and my dad wanted to go shopping when there weren't a lot of crowds there. And I just enjoyed it. I had a happy, healthy childhood of Mormonism. Loved my mission. Had a mistake here or there, broke a rule here and there, but for the most part, it was an exceptional experience.
What is your fondest memory as a Mormon? The most emotional, spiritual, uplifting memory as a Mormon?
After I got home from my mission, I worked in the Logan Temple. Originally, I was hired to be a custodian, and then wound up doing security. So I was a security guard in the temple in Logan, and I had the entire building to myself several nights a week, essentially from midnight till about 5 o'clock in the morning. I had the entire building to myself. To me, as a faithful, believing Mormon in his early 20s who was relatively newly married, that was pretty cool. I mean, to have the building to yourself for hours and hours. I spent a lot of time in the celestial room of the Logan Temple without a soul there. Just me and my God.
What would you do there? Pray?
Pray. I like to think of it more as meditating than prayer. I don't think I was necessarily just praying. I think I was just trying to soak up the temple, and mostly I was trying to understand the temple, because, I mean, my first experience of the temple, I was 19 years old. It was 1987, back in the day when they still had the penalties. And I guess that was the negative. The one negative I can think of was my very first time going through the temple. I had 2 brothers with me, one sitting on each side of me. My mother was there on the other side of the room. And I was born and raised in the church. And with the exception of the brief fling with inactivity when I was 15, 16 years old, I mean, I was active in the church my entire life. Thought I knew it well. And I had no reason to believe otherwise, that not only are we in a normal Christian church, we're in a very, very special Christian church, because this is the only church on earth that has the official stamp of approval from Jesus Christ himself. And I was horrified during the endowment ceremony. I was terrified. I mean, at one point, I'm literally drawing my thumb across my throat, swearing an oath that I will never reveal what I'm doing. And I remember as I did it, turning my head to the left, trying to see my mother out of the corner of my eyes, because I remember sitting in that endowment ceremony thinking to myself, is this a nightmare? Am I awake? And actually, is this actually happening? Because it was so foreign to anything I'd ever experienced. And I know, I mean, unless you're at least 47 years old, odds are, if you're a member of the church, you have no idea. You didn't go through the temple when we were chanting in a foreign language. You didn't go through the temple when we were, pantomiming, slitting your own throat and your stomach and pretending to rip your heart out of your chest and being touched all over your body with oil and water by complete strangers and essentially being just this side of naked. I mean, the washing and anointing ceremony up until 2005 required you to put your underwear on during the ceremony. And it freaked me out, but I went with, the rationalization, which was, you have to go a lot. You have to, there's so much deep meaning in the temple, and you have to go a lot to really understand it. So I spent a lot of hours when I worked in the temple, in the celestial room, trying to understand it and trying to commune with God and get some sort of inspiration. I went to the temple all the time. There was one other, I guess you could say, negative experience for me. When I got married 6 weeks after my mission. I mean, I was a good
6 weeks.
6 weeks.
Did you meet her after your mission?
No, it was the girl that I fell in love with before I went on my mission. She
waited.
She waited.
Holy moly!
I told her when I went on my mission. I encouraged her to date. I said, don't just sit around waiting for me. I said, date. If you find another guy that you think is a better match for you than me, take it, and just send me a letter and just be honest with me. And she did. She dated a little bit when I was on my mission, and I got back, and we. The funny thing is we were actually technically engaged while I was on my mission, and. Right before I got home, I actually Dear Janed her. I wrote her a letter and I said, I really feel like maybe I should be able to date other people. I had one girl in mind. I had a girl I met in the MTC. Her name is Lisa Barrett. And Lisa and I wrote to each other while we were on our missions. Became very close to her just from writing letters back and forth. And I wanted to date Lisa Barrett. So I actually dated for a couple of weeks after my mission. So we actually got married 4 weeks after my last date with another woman. Wow. And we told her parents, actually, we announced the wedding 2 weeks before we got married. When we first told her parents we're getting married in 2 weeks, I believe her mom's first response was, "Oh no, are you pregnant? Oh no." And no, we just knew that if we don't get married soon, we're not going to be worthy to go to the temple, because I was 21, she was 20, and we had hormones raging and all that, and we hadn't seen each other in a couple of years. We knew if we don't get married soon, it's not going to happen in the temple.
So were you married in the Logan Temple?
We did get married in the Logan Temple, December 16th, 1989.
And you were about to say a second bad experience you had in the church related to...
that, actually. When I took the woman, now we're divorced now. We got divorced a few years after we left the church, but she's the mother of my children. And I was deeply in love with her at the time. I took her through the temple for her first experience, and a few people out there might not be aware of it, but when a woman goes to the temple for the first time, and it's because she's getting married, their groom, their future husband, is the one that stands on the other side of the veil and is the one that's doing the handshakes with them at the veil, and is the one that they whisper their new name to. And we get through the process, we get in the celestial room. Now keep in mind, she's got a large family, and very, very active family. Almost all of them extremely active, conservative Mormons. The Salvesons, they're good people. Shout out to the Salvesons. Mike and Carolee Salveson were her parents, and yeah, big family. So a lot of them were there. We get in the celestial room right after her first experience in the endowment ceremony, and this was December of 1989, so the penalties were still intact. And she says to me in the celestial room, with the fakest smile I've ever seen on her face, and she said it like a ventriloquist so that nobody could read her lips. She smiled and she said, "I don't ever want to do that again." And I said, "Wait, what?" And she goes, "I don't ever want to do that again." And I go, Oh no, it gets better, and you just have to go through a lot, and there's a lot. And she goes, I don't ever want to do that again. Here comes my parents. Shut up. And I'm like, all right. And so we got out of the temple, get in the car. The first thing I said to her in the car was, okay, let's talk about what you said in the celestial room. Well, and she goes, I do not ever want to do that again. Why? And I think she was a little upset that I didn't warn her. I didn't give her any heads up. In my defense, I wasn't allowed to. I mean, we swore oaths to never reveal what we were doing, and I didn't tell her. Nobody gave me any heads up, and I wasn't about to violate my covenants and tell her, oh, by the way, when you're doing handshakes and you're going to have to pantomime slitting your own throat, and I didn't tell her. In hindsight, I wish I had, but she was horrified, and this was December of 1989. Keep in mind, we left the church January of 2002. I went through the endowment ceremony probably 50, maybe 75 more times. I worked in the temple, and I got off work at 6 o'clock in the morning. So there was many times after I got off work, I'd go through a session. True to her word, she never went through another endowment ceremony ever again. And that was disturbing to me, to have the woman I was about to marry tell me with a look of true terror on her face. She was frightened that she never wanted to do it again. And this was supposed to be the pinnacle of our experience in the church. I mean, it doesn't get any bigger than receiving your endowments and being in the celestial room. And she's telling me that's not happening again, ever.
So talk about what led to you both leaving the church after being so committed and so devout.
So we got married in '89. We had a few kids. We were very active in the church. In late 2001, my wife and I were co-teachers of the Gospel Essentials class.
And this whole time you're a believing or devout member.
Oh, yeah. In fact, at one point in the early 90s, we were living in Logan, Utah. In the early 90s, I saw in the Herald Journal, in the newspaper, that Ed Decker, the author of The God Makers, was coming to Logan, and he was going to be speaking at this church. And I was just like, oh, hell no, not in my town. So I gathered some dirt on Ed Decker. I reached out, I got a hold of his ex-wife, and I basically said, give me everything you got on Ed. I want the good, the bad, and the ugly, but let's emphasize the bad and the ugly. And I made up a little flyer, and Ed goes to the church. I waited until the little thing started, so everybody's inside, and I went and I put these flyers, which didn't really attack Ed's message. It just was a personal character attack on Ed Decker himself, trying to discredit. It was a very, very typical Mormon response. Don't attack the message, because it's kind of hard to attack the truth, so you attack the messenger. And that's what I did. I put these flyers on the windshield of every car in the parking lot, and somebody caught me, and they took all the flyers off all of the windshields and astoundingly handed them back to me, and they said, well, these aren't welcome here, thank you very much, and we're going to have to ask you to leave the property. Well, this church in Logan only had one driveway, one entrance into and out of the church. And I was wearing a shirt and tie, so I just stood outside of that driveway. And at the end of the service, when everybody got out and they're driving out, there's a guy standing there wearing a shirt and tie, handing out flyers. And so as people were rolling up in their cars and rolling their windows down, I would say, hey, thanks for coming today. Appreciate it. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. And I'm handing them those flyers, basically just sharing personal dirt on Ed Decker. I won't share that now, because it's really irrelevant. Ed's personal history is irrelevant to what I said. It was true. It was all true, but it was not flattering for Ed. And then the next day, he was going to Brigham City. So I went to Brigham City, and the church he was speaking at there is right on Main Street. I think it's called the Church on Main Street or something in Brigham City. But everybody that came into the church literally had to walk right down a public sidewalk and walk in the door right there. So I stood on the public sidewalk handing out flyers to people, telling them, this making a personal character attack on the messenger that they were about to listen to. At one point, Ed came out of the church, had a semi-private conversation with me. It was me and Ed and my older brother Don, and Ed has threatened to sue me over the years. Ed has made thinly veiled threats to come to my place of employment and confront me. On the slim chance Ed has, watches this, special message to Ed, if I may. Bring it on, Ed. You can't sue somebody successfully for telling the truth. And I thought the man was a liar. My personal opinion was he was a liar, and he was just I felt he was a scumbag, honestly. He was attacking the church that I loved and held dear, and even as an ex-Mormon now, I can now look back and realize if it wasn't for the God makers and the lies, if every anti-Mormon book was like the Tanners, man, holy cow! I'm almost sure I would have left the church significantly earlier. I almost blame Ed Decker himself for staying in the church as long as I did.
So what made you leave the church?
September 2001. I was making good money. I wanted to buy something to hang on my wall in my living room that would be a fun conversation piece and would combine my love of church and history. I'm a big history buff. So I thought, wouldn't it be fun to buy an original Mark Hoffman forgery? That's a great conversation piece, The home teachers would be over and they'd be like, is that Joseph Smith's, son's blessing or something or another? My goal originally, I wanted to buy the Joseph Smith III blessing, but it wasn't for sale. But there are Mark Hoffman original and Mark Hoffman forgeries for sale. He made an awful lot of them. For $5,000, maybe $10,000, you can buy a good one. You can buy a doozy. And in the process of trying to find a Mark Hoffman forgery for sale, I accidentally ran across this website. It was like Dr. Shade's page on Mormonism or something to that effect, run by a guy named Jason Galantine. And he had the story of the Kinderhook plates. And a lot of people aren't familiar with it. I will nutshell the Kinderhook plates in 2 minutes. In 1842, there was all the Mormons were living in Nauvoo, Illinois. There was a town 90 miles away called Kinderhook, Illinois. And a couple of guys made this little scheme where we're going to make these bogus little plates. We're going to put some chicken scratches on them. We're going to bury it in a hill at nighttime. And then in the daytime, we'll dig it up and tell everybody, oh my gosh, look what we found. Eventually, word's going to get back to the Mormon prophet, Joseph Smith, and, he might want to buy this because, that's just what he does. And their plan worked pretty flawlessly, actually. The bogus little plates that have become known as the Kinderhook plates found their way to Joseph Smith. I'm sure somebody said, oh, who could translate that? The prophet Joseph Smith. So Joseph Smith gets a hold of these plates, and I'll paraphrase, but it's close to an exact quote. He said of these bogus plates that were made a few nights before, I see they contain a record of the man with whom they were buried. He was a descendant of Ham, through the loins of the Pharaoh, and he received his kingdom from the ruler of heaven and earth. And, of course, the crowd of Mormons around, I'm sure, cheered, and, oh, yay! The Mormon newspaper in Nauvoo, the Times and Seasons, had copies of all of the plates. There's 6 plates, the front and back of all 6 of them. On the front page of the newspaper, another local newspaper referred to these Kinderhook plates as nothing short of a sequel to the Book of Mormon. The problem is that as an amateur apologist on my mission, I knew about the Kinderhook plates. And the church even ran an Ensign article about it back in the early 80s when one of these plates was found, and they did some testing on it and verified, okay, they're definitely bogus. And the church published this and said this, these plates are bogus. But the church's spin on the Kinderhook plates was slightly different than the version that I was reading online. And it dawned on me there was a slight difference. The quote that was attributed to Joseph Smith, where he said, I see they contain a record of the man with whom they were buried, blah, blah, blah. The church's response to that essentially was, some member wrote this in their journal. And unfortunately, when B.H. Roberts was compiling the history of the church, he took it from a third-hand account and turned it into a first-hand account. The truth of the matter is, Joseph Smith didn't actually say this. Somebody wrote in their journal, President Smith said, the plates contain a record of the man with whom they were buried, and so on and so forth. Where he got this idea, we just don't know. But unfortunately, it made its way into the history of the church, and it is what it is. Well, the person who wrote this in their journal was William Clayton, Joseph Smith's personal, paid, professional secretary, who also, in his journal, wrote, I think it was Doctrine and Covenants, section 130, 131, 132, and I was upset. I'm a history buff, and it felt to me like the church was intentionally altering history. They were intentionally hiding the truth. They knew damn good and well that William Clayton was known for his impeccable record keeping, and they wanted to have their cake and eat it too. They wanted to say, okay, this page of this man's journal, totally unreliable. We don't even know who this guy is. 16 pages later, this is the Word of God and it's canonized Scripture. And I just thought, as a Mormon, you can't have it both ways. Either the man's reliable or he's just some unreliable source. You can't have it both ways. But the Mormon mind in me rationalized it. I thought, you know what? Maybe this is why the prophet Joseph Smith was killed. Maybe this is why the Lord allowed him to be killed, because he knew that he was going to translate these bogus plates and maybe turn it into the book of Kinderhook. And I thought, the Lord will never allow his servant, the prophet, to lead the people astray. So maybe that's what happened. And I thought, Joseph Smith isn't perfect. He had an ego. I'm sure I think at the time I felt like if somebody's bringing him these plates and they're saying, "Hey, what does it say?" He didn't have the courage to simply go, "Boy, guys, I am drawing a blank on this. I really don't know." Or the Lord himself didn't whisper to him with a still small voice and say, "Those plates are fakes. They're trying to fool you." In the Bible, I think you've got the Apostle Paul. There was an incident where somebody tried to con him, and his power of discernment kicked in right away, and he called BS on the guy. But that didn't happen with Joseph Smith. So I thought maybe the Lord allowed him to be killed in Carthage because he was about to lead the people astray. But I had to know for sure. And I asked myself, is it possible? Is there anything else that maybe he lied about? And so I went to Deseret Book. I didn't trust the anti-Mormons. I went to Deseret Book, and I said, essentially, give me everything you have, the church has ever published on the Book of Abraham. If it has the word papyra, Book of Abraham, or Pearl of Great Price in it, I want to buy it. And I got a stack of books and flyers and magazines and all sorts of stuff. And I was self-employed at the time. I basically told my employees, I'm taking a little leave of absence. I need you to run the company.
Was this bail bonds?
Yeah.
Bail bond company?
I was my father-in-law and I were partners in a bail bond company. And it was lucrative.
In Ogden?
It was all over the state.
Okay.
And that company was my baby. I named the company. I had the logo created. I answered the phone for every jail but one in the entire state of Utah. If you were in jail and you called, the company doesn't exist anymore, but if you called our company in any jail in Utah but one, I was the one that answered the phone. And customer service was my specialty. If somebody called me at 3 a.m. and they said, can you get me out of jail, I would be putting my shoes and socks on before I was done with the conversation and be on my way to the jail before we even hung up. So I did very, very well with it, and made a good living. And
So you took a leave.
I took a leave, and I spent.
What clued you in to the idea that the Book of Abraham may have problems? Was that Dr. Shade's website, or do you?
No, it was just.
Do you remember?
I felt like it was the most recent. I mean, with the exception of the Doctrine and Covenants, it was the most recent thing that we had that Joseph Smith had translated, and we had the papyrus. I mean, the papyrus was found in the 1966. So we had the translation, we had the original source, and I thought this is a good way to test and see if he's telling the truth, or if he did he lie about anything else?
Right. So there were problems with the translation of the Kinderic plates. Maybe there were other translation problems. Okay. So you studied Book of Abraham, and what'd you find out? You don't have to go into Book of Abraham, because we have whole episodes about that. But what did you conclude from your study?
I read, honestly, for 18 hours a day for probably about a week and a half, and I went through those books pretty quick. I'm reading Hugh Nibley books, and I realized very quickly into my study of the Book of Abraham that it was a fake. I actually got very angry. And as the Incredible Hulk would say, you don't want to see me when I'm angry. I was very angry. I felt very deceived. I felt duped. I thought the evidence is overwhelming. Nobody. I mean, you could take the facsimiles that are in the Book of Abraham, and they're in the Pearl of Great Price. To this day, take them to any Egyptologist in the entire world and show them the translation and ask them, is he close? I mean, is he in the same ballpark? He's not even playing the same sport. It's to say that his translation was ridiculous would be an understatement, and I quickly realized.
The word Abraham doesn't even appear in the papyrus.
No,
right?
I mean it's. I was shocked. I remember thinking to myself, "Oh my God, he made it up. He made up the Book of Abraham," and I just my head was spinning, and I'm like, now I've really got to dig into this. So the next step was the Doctrine and Covenants. I got a photographic reprint, you can buy them online, of the original Doctrine and Covenants, the Book of Commandments, 1833. And 2 years later, he came out with the Doctrine and Covenants. He made a few alterations, And so I had the 1833 Book of Commandments, the 1835 Doctrine and Covenants, and like a 1984 Doctrine and Covenants. And I read chapter 1, verse 1 in 1833, 1835, and 1984, and I had pins and highlighters, and I'm marking these things, and I'm marking changes. And it's funny, people talk about the changes made to the Book of Mormon. There's nearly 4,000 changes made to the Book of Mormon. Most of them, in my opinion, are relatively minor. Not a lot of doctrinal, changes. The changes to the Book of Mormon, changes to the Book of Mormon pale in comparison to the changes in the Doctrine and Covenants. If the Book of Mormon has 4,000 changes, the Doctrine and Covenants, if it has less than 10,000 changes, I would be shocked. I mean, right off the bat, like literally in the first couple of verses, I'm like, well, he's changing. Now, this isn't something that was translated from Reformed Egyptian into English using the gift and power of God. This was God talking to Joseph Smith, his scribe writing it down. I mean, how was this lost in translation? Because there is no translation process, but the changes were just massive. In some cases,
give us an example of a couple major ones.
I mean,
the ones that were
there
most...
was one. The one that stood out the most to me was there was a verse that said something to the effect of the Lord telling Joseph Smith that he'll only have one gift, and that is the gift to translate the plates, and that's it. Well, that was 1833. Now, a couple years later, Joseph's thinking, okay, I gotta do more than just the plates. You know, I mean, back then the Mormons' attitude was, what have you done for us lately? And so he knew that I've got to keep the con going. So he made some significant changes. Now, instead of just being blessed with the gift to translate the plates, he was blessed with the gift of revelation and many more wonderful
prophecy,
gifts.
revelation.
Yeah, it was disturbing. In fact, I believe it was David Whitmer who wrote a pamphlet called An Address to All Believers in the Book of Mormon. He also wrote another one called An Address to All Believers in Christ, where, and I'll paraphrase here, he said something to the effect of, is there any man who would profess a belief in God that would believe that he would work in such a manner? That he would give a revelation and then a couple years later completely reverse the wording and intent of that original revelation. David Whitmer was pissed, and he didn't leave quietly. I mean, he left the church and he was writing pamphlets and spreading them amongst the members of the church because he felt like Joseph Smith was a fallen prophet. He may have been a prophet, he may have been inspired to write the Book of Mormon or translate the Book of Mormon, but no, he's gone off the deep end.
Any other changes that made you super upset that you remember? Well, I remember one, which is either the original Book of Commandments or Doctrine and Covenants or both, basically explicitly forbade polygamy. They denounced the practice of polygamy and said, we have one husband, one wife. I'm paraphrasing. And then we fast forward 7 or 8 years or 100 years or however long it took, D&C 132 comes in saying the opposite of what the early version of the Doctrine and Covenants said.
I think what struck me the most with the Doctrine and Covenants was this was really, although I'd read it before, I read it on my mission, this is the first time I'd ever read the Doctrine and Covenants, and not just the D&C, but 3 different versions of it, that I realized there's literally nothing in this that's really prophetic. There's nothing at all. I mean, even like people will say, Mormons will say, well, there's a Civil War prophecy. And my words of advice are, you take a closer look at the Civil War prophecy. You read that, you look at the history of the Civil War, and back in the day when Joseph Smith said that, to say that, boy, man, we're on the verge of a war, and if it starts anywhere, it's gonna be South Carolina. I'm telling you, because the people in South Carolina are really getting pissed. That'd be like today saying, one day there will be a nuclear war, and when there is, North Korea will play a hand in it. It's like, well, yeah, it was common knowledge at the time that there was a lot of turmoil in the United States regarding slavery, and South Carolina was a hotbed of that turmoil.
But also, if a civil war hadn't have broken out starting in South Carolina, it probably would have been taken out of the Doctrine and Covenants, right?
Well, it didn't spread to all nations. And I've heard rationalizations, people saying, but see, that's the beginning of all wars. People act like before the Civil War, there wasn't war anywhere in the world, and now it seems like there's always some country that's at war, and it's just ridiculous. There's nothing prophetic in the Doctrine and Covenants, and I went through that relatively quickly and realized, okay, well, the Doctrine and Covenants is worthless. But surely, maybe the community of Christ, the reorganized church, maybe they have it right. Maybe Joseph Smith truly was a prophet. Maybe he translated the Book of Mormon, but then he kind of became a fallen prophet. And maybe I'm just in the wrong branch of Mormonism. Maybe I should be in the reorganized church or the community of Christ. Maybe I should be a Strangite. I don't know. So I dove into the Book of Mormon, and I wanted to know if the Book of Mormon could possibly be a figment of Joseph Smith's imagination, like the Book of Abraham, like the Kinderhook plates, like the Doctrine and Covenants. And I looked at the Book of Mormon not so much from a doctrinal point of view. I figured, how do you test it? The Bible says, prove all things, hold fast that which is good. So I decided I'm going to prove it. I'll prove the Book of Mormon either true or not true. From a scientific point of view, I wanted to use the scientific method to determine the truthfulness of something. And so I looked at everything from archaeology and geology and botany and linguistics. Every single field of science said this book is not true. And at that point, I wasn't surprised. I'd already, came to the conclusion the Book of Abraham is nonsense, the Doctrine and Covenants is worthless, and then I realized, all right, Native Americans aren't Jewish immigrants who rode around the plains in horse-drawn chariots, wielding steel weapons and armor. They didn't have domesticated elephants. That's in the Book of Ether. You've got domesticated elephants in the Americas. Roughly, I believe that was supposed to be about 2600 BC. It's so ridiculous to say that the Native Americans were riding around the plains in horse-drawn chariots. I have an analogy. I tell people, what if I had a book and I said, this is Thomas Jefferson's personal journal, covering the years 1775 through 1777, and it's in Thomas Jefferson's handwriting. But in the middle of the book, he says, I told General Washington that I would drive my Corvette to meet him at McDonald's, and if I couldn't do that, I'd just fax him a copy of the Declaration. Now, if I tried to sell such a journal, nobody in their right mind would believe this was legitimate. And that's just 3 very minor little anachronisms. I mean, come on. Corvettes, McDonald's, fax machines. Thomas Jefferson, they're really only about 150 years out of date, right? Well, Native Americans riding around in horse-drawn chariots 2,000 years ago is roughly 1,500 years out of date. Domesticated elephants in the Book of Mormon they're roughly 3,500 years out of date. And so it's not like it's just one anachronism. There's dozens of anachronisms. You can't have Native Americans harvesting wheat and barley and having cattle and honeybees. It was so ridiculous. And I literally would call museums. I would call, because I still didn't trust those blasted anti-Mormons, and so I would call, like I remember calling the Denver Museum of Natural History and getting a hold of the main curator, the head honcho at the Denver Museum of Natural History, and I asked him a simple question: are you familiar with the Book of Mormon? And he said, I am. I said, is it even possible that Native Americans had these steel weapons and wheat and barley and horses and chariots and all that? And he said, absolutely not. It is not just not possible, it is preposterous. And he agreed with me that I asked him if there's anybody else, any experts in the subject that might be able to help, and he said, well, I mean, besides me, I could give you the names of hundreds of experts in any field of science you want, whether it's archaeology or linguistics, genetics, zoology, botany. He said there's all of the evidence says the Book of Mormon isn't true. So take that for what it's worth. And I didn't just call one guy. I called multiple museum directors and asked them, and they all just kind of immediately scoffed and patted me on the proverbial head and said, "Oh, bless your heart." No. Not only is it not possible, it's not even remotely possible. And I knew, honestly. I knew it wasn't true. I knew it. I tell people now, when Mormons bear their testimony and they say, I know the church is true, I say, well, I know it's not, and you have your faith and your feelings to back up your belief that it's true. I have literally every single field of science telling me that it's not true. In fact, that's why I don't believe it, because of all the evidence. It's not because I went out looking for the evidence because I believe it wasn't true. It's I believe it was true. I went out looking for evidence and realized it's not true. Not only would I bet my life on it that it's not true, I would, and I have, but bet the eternal souls of my children on it. Because when we left the church, my wife and I and our kids, we didn't, it was my entire family left the church. When I told my wife, I will never forget this. We left the house, we were going out to dinner, and I hadn't said a word to her. It had been, I don't know, a week and a half, maybe 2 weeks of me just reading constantly, all day long. I mean, we're talking literally 18, 19, 20 hours a week, a day rather. I was getting very little sleep, and as soon as I woke up, I would be reading, and I'd be reading while I was laying in bed. We're driving down the street, and I said to her, what would you say if I told you, and I kind of paused because I knew that once the words came out of my mouth, I couldn't take them back, and I knew what the potential repercussions would be. I knew I might be ending my marriage right there on the spot. I said, what would you say if I told you that Joseph Smith was a pathological liar and the church isn't true? And I didn't even make eye contact with her. I'm driving, and I'm just kind of waiting, and I pull up to a stop sign, and I stop, and I turn and I look at her, and she has tears streaming down her face, and she says, why would you say that? Why would you say such a thing? And I said, because the church isn't true. And Joseph Smith was a pathological liar. And she screamed, she'd go home, we're not going to dinner. And she was so upset. And we sat down and spent the next 3 hours. I spent the next 3 hours with all this evidence, putting it out in front of her. It's still, to this day, that was one of the hardest things I've ever done in my life.
Why are you getting emotional right now?
Because I don't talk about that often, and it was, at the time, it was the worst time in my entire life, honestly. I was born and raised in the church. I loved it, I lived it, and I left it. It rocked her world. She was very upset. She was instantly in tears. Insisted we go home, and I said, "Yeah, we need to go home. We need to have a talk." And I spent 3 hours just showing her everything, and she was like, "Okay, you make a compelling case." But our testimonies. We felt the Spirit, and I told her about another thing that I think might have been the deal breaker for her. For me, I came to the conclusion the church wasn't true, but I was like 99.9% sure it wasn't true. But I'd had these spiritual experiences in my life. The Spirit had told me that it was true, and all the evidence said it wasn't. And I thought, I really wanted a spiritual confirmation that the church was true as well, because I had the physical proof, but I didn't have the spiritual testimony to back it up. Well, to digress just a pinch, about 2.5 years before this incident, in late 2001, I was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease, and it scared the hell out of me. I realized that I may, I saw enough of Michael J. Fox to know that's my future. And it was very frightening. Diagnosed by more than one doctor, neurologist. And I remember praying constantly at this time. And I was standing in the shower. I'm going to say it was October 4th of 2001. And I was praying in the shower. And at the time, I don't know if you know much about Parkinson's disease. One of the first things that go is your balance. I had horrible balance, absolutely horrible balance. I could not stand in the middle of a room and close my eyes without having my hand on something without falling over relatively quickly, because my balance was just terrible. I took medication for it. I took a pill 3 times a day. And on the morning of October 4th, I'm standing in the shower and I'm praying, and I essentially said in my mind to God, I have come to the conclusion that the church is not true. Am I right? And because I wanted to make it real simple for God. I figured, Joseph Smith prayed. He got an answer to his prayers. Hell, God appeared to him. I didn't necessarily expect God to show up in my bathroom, but I did expect an answer. And I firmly believed the church may not be true, but I was convinced there is a God. And if there is a God, and if he cares at all about me, he will answer this prayer. I was legitimately disappointed when I got out of the shower and did not see a yes or a no written in the steam on the mirror. I mean, that's how much faith I had. I had so much faith that God will answer my prayer that I knew there will be an answer, and I will get it, and it will be undeniable. And the answer didn't come that day. I was kind of disappointed, actually. Went to bed that night, and as I was crawling in the bed, I realized I hadn't taken my medicine that day. I take it 3 times a day. I hadn't taken it that day, and I was tired, had been reading all day, didn't really give it a lot of thought. I just whatever. So I got up the next day, and it was just habit. Every day I'd get up and I'd take a pill. And, usually around lunchtime I'd take another pill, and at nighttime I'd take another one. But the next day, October 5th, for whatever reason, it just didn't cross my mind to take my pills. At the end of that day, I remember laying in bed thinking to myself, why? I didn't take my medicine yesterday. I didn't take it today. And yet I was having no tremors. Under normal circumstances, if I skipped one pill, my wife could usually tell, and she would ask me, did you take your pill this morning? Because I would have a tremor in my hand that was pretty obvious. As long as I took the medication, I was okay. The tremors were minimal, if at all. My balance still sucked, but I didn't have tremors as long as I took the medication. And I didn't take the medicine on the next day or the next day. I just stopped taking it. And yet the signs, the symptoms of the Parkinson's just disappeared. I told my wife, I said, by the way, because she was, concerned about the spiritual aspect of it. We got our testimonies. Maybe the evidence says no, but our testimonies. And I said, I have a testimony. I asked God, I told God point blank, the church isn't true. I want an answer. Am I right? Am I wrong? I said, I haven't taken my medicine in 2 weeks. She says, well, what do you mean? I said, I haven't taken my medicine in 2 weeks. And she knew that it's not possible. If I had skipped that medicine for 2 weeks, I would be having tremors like crazy. She actually made me stand up in the middle of the room with my eyes closed. I'm like, look here. I was standing on one foot. I'm telling you, I said, my balance feels like it's back to normal. It's just gone. And to me at the time, that was an answer to my prayer. It was almost like God was saying to me, congratulations. You've graduated into reality. Here's a little graduation gift. You want a miracle? I'll give you a miracle. And I took that to this day. That was 2001. I have never had any symptoms of Parkinson's disease since October 3rd of 2001. I've had people say, well, maybe you were misdiagnosed. Maybe you know what? I don't know. I really don't know, and I don't care. I don't say that I was cured. All I know is it's gone.
And is there a chance, I mean, one way to think about that is, and I once had an experience where I was talking to a friend who was grieving over the fact that he had presided in a stake high council and a disciplinary council where a woman had committed adultery and she was being excommunicated. And he was reflecting back on having played a role in her excommunication. He was feeling so much guilt and shame that he had taken part in the shaming of this woman, that as he retold the story to me, in the basement of my Logan house, his hands swelled to twice their normal size. It was sort of this hive-like reaction to the stress that he was experiencing from the remorse of having taken part in such a dehumanizing experience. That's why I saw severe physiological reactions to the trauma of a faith crisis. Is it possible that those symptoms, those tremors, were simply physical manifestations of the stress and the anxiety and the distress you were under trying to make sense of everything? And that once you arrived at the simple conclusion for you that it just wasn't true, that alleviated the stress that your body was under?
No, I was actually diagnosed a couple of years before we left the church. I don't understand it. I believe in God. I still do. I guess I identify myself as a deist. I believe in, and even when I say God, I sometimes will put it in quotation marks. I believe in a higher power. I don't think this higher power cares what kind of underwear we wear. I don't think this higher power cares whether we give money to a multi-billion-dollar corporation or the minister down on the street corner. Frankly, sometimes I think this higher power is like a 10-year-old child with an ant farm that forgets about the ant farm and puts it in his closet. I don't necessarily believe that God is a loving Father in heaven who knows us each individually by name and knows how many hairs are on our heads. And ironically, I believe that when we die, our spirits, our souls, the spark of energy that's in us that gives us life goes somewhere. And I think when we all die, that spark in us that gives us life, I think all of those sparks go to the same place. And I think that place is God. So in an ironic way, I think that we become part of God when we die. I mean, people give Mormons a bad time. You believe you can become gods. I don't think that we can become gods. I think we become part of whatever God is.
So does that mean you feel like God maybe healed you from your Parkinson's?
I do. I believe in miracles. I firmly believe in miracles. And you can define miracles however you want, but I have witnessed a miracle myself in my own body. And I know I've had numerous people over the years, you're probably misdiagnosed. You know what, whatever. All I know is I had all the signs and symptoms of Parkinson's, right. Had tremors every single day for years, had to take medication for it multiple times a day, and I didn't intentionally stop. It's not like I said, I'm going to test God and stop taking my medication. Just the thought of taking the medication just didn't even cross my mind.
I get it. So to conclude this first episode of your interview, I just want to say I'm loving it so far. That was very powerful. I think a lot of people are going to find what you've shared so far very meaningful. I'm going to ask you to end with a very specific targeted question. And I don't want you to talk intellectually. I don't want you to tell any more stories. I want you to answer this question emotionally, okay? I referenced at the very beginning of our interview that when I talked to you on the phone and you cried, that moved me. And you've been brought to tears a couple times just during this hour and a half. Will you please explain to me emotionally what those tears were about when you talked about how difficult it was to tell your wife that you no longer believe in the church? Emotionally, what comes up for you when those tears started falling? Why do tears come to your mind emotionally as you retell that experience?
So you want to make me cry again?
What are you feeling right now, and what do those feelings mean to you? What do they mean to you?
It's recalling the most devastating, horrible experience of my entire life. I was born and raised in the church and literally knew no different my entire life. I was 33 years old and had 3 kids, was very active in the church, and to realize almost overnight, I mean, it was over the course of a couple of weeks, that it wasn't true, and my world was spinning, and it was to tell my wife that, who was also born and raised in the church, who comes from an extremely conservative family, that the church isn't true. I knew at the time there's a good chance this is going to lead to our marriage dissolving. It was the most difficult thing I've ever done in my life to tell my wife. I couldn't even look her in the eye. I literally did not look her in the eye as I told her. I was looking straight ahead as I'm driving because I couldn't look her in the eye and tell her everything we know, everything that we love, it's all a farce. It's a fraud. Joseph Smith was a charlatan. We've been duped. And then during the course of our 3-hour conversation, I told her, we're in a cult, and now we've got to do something about it.
And so the emotions behind those tears, just list the emotions right now. The ones that you're experiencing right now.
It's just
fear. Was it joy?
It was an
anger?
overwhelming sense of loss. I felt like,
Loss?
I had a friend years ago that lost one of his children, and every time he would talk about the loss of his child, he would start crying. And at the time, I've never lost a child. I didn't understand it. Well, I couldn't relate to it. I could certainly understand it. You lose your child, yeah. But, I mean, years later, he would talk about it, and he'd start crying. And I kind of feel the same way now. It was an overwhelming sense of loss that this church that I knew and that I loved, that I defended, that I served a mission for, that I extended my mission twice, everything that I knew to be true was all a con. We'd been duped.
And you felt
anger. I was extremely angry.
And anger's a secondary emotion, so there must have been.
First, it was overwhelming sense of loss. Just
so sad.
Very sad. I mean, I'm not sad now. I'm elated that we left, but thinking back on that and turning to the mother of my children and saying something to her that instantly brought her to tears. It was devastating to me when I discovered it. It was devastating to her when I shared it with her, and you know, I told her we've got to get out, and boy did we ever.
I want to give Mike a round of applause for that. So this is. Thank you, Mike. This concludes part 1 of my interview with Mike Norton. We're going to immediately start part 2. But I just want to thank everyone who supported us so far. I want to thank those of you who have tuned in. Thank everyone here for being a part of it. It's been beautiful. And I really look forward to part 2. So don't go away. Come right back and join us for part 2 of our interview with Mike Norton to talk about how he goes from leaving the church to an activist, I'll put gently, against the church. So thanks, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. Pause about interviewing Mike. I'd say one sort of thing flipped me, maybe a couple things flipped me recently to make me open to interviewing Mike. The first was a private conversation I had with Mike over the phone where he started talking to me about his motivations. And if I can be totally honest, he actually started crying during that phone conversation about how what his motives were and how important this work was to him. And he showed this real emotionally vulnerable side that showed to me sort of the heart behind what he does. So that sort of made me say, wow, Mike's a little more nuanced or a little more sophisticated or complex than probably his public image. And so that made me want to say, hey, that's something worth showing. And so just like with that Sean McCraney interview I did many, many years ago where so many people saw him as this evil anti-Mormon, he showed a personal side that was actually quite revealing and interesting to my listeners. I am engaging and approaching this interview with sort of the same intent. So I've talked to Mike, and I've requested of him before this interview that we not, say explicit things about the temple that would be offensive to our believing listeners, that we do our best not to use this opportunity to trash the Mormon church or be disrespectful to it. The spirit and the heart behind my intention of this interview is to show Mike's story and to show kind of what makes him tick and what motivates him, and to try and probe a little bit more to understand why he uses the tactics he does. So hopefully that's where this interview, the spirit of this interview, comes from. I'll just also say something that may be viewed as a little bit controversial. I see, I've been willing to interview Mormon apologists on Mormon Stories because we try and do a balance. And I see Mormon apologists as no more ethical than in the outcome of what they do than the work that Mike does. So I'm not saying their tactics are comparable, but in terms of the ethics of the outcome of the work of Mormon apologetics versus the ethics of the outcome of Mike's work, I don't see apologists as having any more of an upper hand in terms of morals or ethics than Mike. And so if I'm willing to interview, and I'm eager to interview Mormon apologists, then I feel like it's fair to interview.
And so people that are shocked that you would interview me, I just tell them we've been talking about doing this for well over 10 years.
Yeah, so check out episode 3 of Mormon Stories with Hiram, which was Noah's compadre in that early podcast. All right, so Noah, Mike Norton. I don't know where Noah came from.
That's my new name. Please.
That's right, NewNameNoah. That's right, NewNameNoah. I should mention that. That's the handle you go by.
NewNameNoah.
So, Mike, let's begin by just talking about your early Mormon story. Talk about if you want to talk briefly about your ancestry. Do you have Mormon ancestry? Were you a convert to the church? Were you born in the covenant?
Yeah. On my father's side, my father was a 4th generation Mormon, so I guess it'd be 5th. And my children were 6th generation Mormons. My mother was a convert to the church, joined in her early 20s because she was dating my father and he was LDS, and she had a reason to join. So I was born and raised in the church.
Where?
Primarily Colorado and Southern California, up near Bakersfield in the San Joaquin Valley. Had a happy, healthy upbringing and childhood. I was the youngest of 7 kids, 6 boys and 1 girl. And I actually got baptized just a few days after my 8th birthday, which I thought was kind of cool. The date I was baptized on the 4th of July, 1976. So it was the bicentennial. I remember my dad telling me the reason for all these fireworks is because you joined the church. And even back then, I was smart enough to know that wasn't entirely accurate. But truth be told, I loved the church growing up, with the exception of a very, very brief period, maybe I'd say maybe 9 months to a year. When I was about 15, 16 years old, I guess 16, I went inactive for a period of time. Typical teenage kid. I just wasn't interested in going to church for 3 hours a day. 3 hours every Sunday. So I went inactive for a short period of time. I worked with a bunch of friends that all smoked, and it got to the point where I actually started smoking cigarettes a little bit, and that was my brief fling with inactivity.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Mormon Stories podcast. I am your host, as always, John DeLynn. I am super excited for today's interview. It is October 19th, 2017, and we are coming to you recorded from someone's gracious home in Murray, Utah. And we have a crowd of people here gathered to enjoy a special interview with, I would say, one of the most controversial figures in Mormonism of the past 2 decades. His name is Mike Norton, and I first learned about Mike back in 2004, 2005, when Mike, along with his friend whose code name was Hiram, started a podcast called The Church Is Not True. And that was a podcast that I listened to before I started Mormon Stories podcast, and that was part of an inspiration for me to start Mormon Stories podcast from a lot of different perspectives. And so, but it didn't take me long after listening to that podcast, The Church Is Not True, to learn about Mike. Mike had a history from even before that podcast. As far as I know, Mike was the first, if not one of the first people to record the LDS Church's temple ceremonies and put them on the internet. He also created a website, as far as I know, called josephlied.com, and would sort of stand outside, as I remember, temples like the Manti Temple and hold up the sign and advertise that website to people who are coming in and out of the temple. Now, I may get some of these facts wrong, but this is my memory of Mike. Since then, Mike has done other things after they ended their podcast. Mike kind of disappeared for a while as far as I was paying attention, but then he resurfaced doing something super controversial, which was to assume someone else's identity as an active Mormon, become fully active in the church as a resigned Mormon, okay, under the name of this other person who lent his identity, Mike, because I feel like the impact of his work is as legitimate as the impact of the work of Mormon apologists. So we could talk about that more in future episodes. So that's my long disclaimer. Before we totally jump in, I just want to thank everyone who supports Mormon Stories podcast. Your donations make this possible. So if you appreciate this work, if you benefit from it, just know that all this is possible because of the donations of those who contribute to the Open Stories Foundation and the Mormon Stories. We're going to be doing more events like this in the coming months and years, where in the Salt Lake area and maybe other areas, we invite people to attend these events, not only so they can get a personal sense of these interviews, but so that they can ask questions and meet some of the people involved. So what we're doing to sort of thank those who donate to us is that we make sure even though these events are free to attend, we offer Mormon Stories and Open Stories Foundation donors first opportunities to join these events. So if you want to be a part of these sorts of events, one incentive is to become a monthly subscriber at 10 or 15 or 25 or $100 a month, whatever you can afford. And one of the benefits you'll get is you'll be put on an email list and given early invite. So for those of you who are here, who are donors, I just want to thank you for your support because you make all this possible. So thank you. We are looking at setting up a Patreon website that we can use to help incentivize other people to donate to Mormon Stories. So be looking for a Patreon website called Mormon Stories in the coming weeks. We'll tell you more about that as we solidify those plans. And then finally, we have various workshops and retreats coming up to support transitioning and post-Mormons. Please go to mormonstories.org/events. There are events in October and November of 2017 in the Salt Lake area and in San Francisco area. So we'd love to have you attend if you can. So those are all the business items. Mike Norton, after over a decade of being aware of your work, welcome to Mormon Stories Podcast.
Thank you. Thank you. In fact, your third episode was Hiram, my podcast partner back in 2005.
That's right. In fact, I did that interview before I interviewed Greg Prince.
Yeah. In fact, you talked with Hiram and specifically talked about the plan to interview him and me separately, he and I separately. And
Kennedy to Mike. And then Mike got active in the church, got a calling, and received a temple recommend under a fake identity, and then re-entered the temple to record the new temple ceremonies to sort of capture all the changes. And that's about as hardcore gangster of an approach to dealing with the LDS Church as I've ever heard. So we'll be talking about that. And then most recently, it was Mike Norton who was the first to, as I understand it, release the video of Savannah that ended up going viral and global. And as Mike's told me, I think tens of millions of people across the world have now watched that video of Savannah, which is the young 12, 13-year-old girl who came out as lesbian during her testimony in her Mormon ward, and a member of her bishopric asked her to turn off the microphone, or turned off the microphone, asked her to sit down before she was able to finish her interview. So Mike has been involved in a lot of stuff. And I've known about Mike for a long, long time. And for a long, long time, I didn't want to interview Mike. And we could talk about that, but I'll just explain why I've chosen to interview Mike. So I didn't interview Mike for a long time because I didn't really have a sense for who he was or his motivations. And frankly, especially while I was active in the church and extra sensitive to being excommunicated, I didn't want to do anything that could jeopardize my membership. Since then, I still will be candid. I've been really torn about Mike's tactics. I don't want this interview at all to be construed as an endorsement of Mike's tactics necessarily, because these are things that I personally wouldn't do, many of the things he's done. And there are things that I wouldn't encourage other people to do, especially when it comes to breaking the law, if there have been instances where he's broken the law, and we'll talk about that. But I also believe that, there are issues and controversies around, how sacred the Mormon temple ceremony is to people, violation of the church's property, and just, what does Mike's actions do to the reputation of people who leave the church? Does the sorts of actions that Mike does give post-Mormons and ex-Mormons a bad name, in the sense of fulfilling the stereotypes that post-Mormons are angry and bitter and broken and sad and willing to do anything to harm the church? And I'm not saying anything bad about Mike. I'm just saying those have been the types of things that have given me